Okay, morning everybody. Welcome to the Pegasus Group webinar on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So joining me this morning are my colleagues from Pegasus, Matt Good, a Director in Planning in our Leeds office, and Neil Tiley, a Director in Planning in our Cirencester office. So I'm going to kick things off by giving a high-level overview of the recent economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which hopefully will be quite timely given all the recent announcements and the upcoming announcements today from the Chancellor in terms of the further restrictions on activities to try and stem the flow of the pandemic. So I'll be doing that, and then I'll be handing over to Matt so he can give an overview of housing supply and delivery issues related to the pandemic, and then Neil's going to be finishing off by giving his thoughts on a very emotive topic at the moment, the Standard Method and calculating future housing numbers across the country. So I should also say we want the session to be as interactive as possible. So once myself, Matt and Neil have finished going through our slides, please do take the opportunity on Zoom to ask questions and answers in the usual way. We'll be saving the Q&A until the end. So obviously if you get a chance to think of any questions during any of our presentations, please do take the opportunity to ask them, and we'll make sure we cover them as best we can towards the end. So if I just share my screen now to kick things off. Okay, right, so in terms of the impact of, or the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic so far, obviously one of the big things people have seen is the impact on the economy. So we are officially, the UK is officially in recession at the moment. That's 2 quarters of successive negative growth. You'll see from the chart on the screen that it was a substantial decline in our economic outputs over the first half of the year. And when you compare that to the recession of 2008-2009, the drop is far more substantial and has been far more significant. One from a positivity, I guess, from all of this is that in July 2020, the economy, as we emerged from lockdown, did actually grow by about just over 6.5%. So you'll see from the chart that it's starting to look like a V-shaped recovery that a lot of the economists, including the senior economist at the Bank of England, predicted, although obviously with the recent announcements about the more stringent, not necessarily lockdown measures, but local lockdown measures, this V-shaped recovery may not actually emerge. One of the main impacts of lower economic growth because of the pandemic has obviously been the impact on the labour market, in particular unemployment. So surprisingly, the latest unemployment figures for the UK actually suggest that unemployment is about just over 4%, 4.1% for the latest time frame, according to the Office for National Statistics. That actually equates to about 1.4 million people who are currently out of work and would like work. And that's actually an increase over the last year of just over 100,000. But if you look back 12 months previously, unemployment was only about 3.8%. It has been at historic lows. And to put that into context, after the 08-09 recession, unemployment did go up, but because it was such a prolonged recovery, unemployment nationally didn't actually peak until it was towards the end of 2011. So unemployment there was about, I think it's 8.5%. So we are some way off that, which is good. And I guess a lot of that reflects the fact that we've had the Chancellor's furlough scheme saving a lot of jobs that may otherwise have been lost. And I think today, I think it's at 12:30 today, the Chancellor is actually going to be announcing new measures to hopefully reduce or mitigate the risk of further job losses in the future. But I've said unemployment is still relatively low when you consider it to historic highs. But the other way of looking at the labour market and potential challenges moving forward is the alternative way is to consider something called the Claimant count. For those not familiar with it, the Claimant count generally is taken to be the number of people claiming job seekers allowance or universal credit and who are actively seeking work and who are required to seek work and are actually available for work. What has also been added since the COVID-19 pandemic started is that people can now start claiming unemployment-related benefits to top up their wages because they've obviously been reduced as a result of the virus not working as many hours. So what that means is that as of August this year, there were about 2.7 million people classed as claiming benefits, and compared to March 2020, so not that long ago, the figure was about 1.3 million. So the number of claimants has actually more than doubled in the last 4 to 5 months. So that is a very significant rise, and it's one to keep an eye on moving forward. What the labour market is also facing is there are certain sectors within the labour market that have been highlighted as having more jobs at risk relative to other industry sectors within the economy. The top three, and this chart here I took from McKinsey, the management consultancy, did some analysis back in, it was May, June time at the start, really when we were in the middle of lockdown, looking at which jobs in the UK were most at risk by sector. And I think this will probably surprise none of you when I say it was accommodation and food services were hardest hit by the lockdown, and over 2/3 of jobs they estimated that were actually at risk because of the pandemic. What you can also do is, in terms of looking at the impact at a more local level, is you can look at the current sector composition of the labour market by sector for different local authorities across the country. And when you do that in terms of, so if we take the top three, the three sectors in the red box on this slide, accommodation and food services down to wholesale and retail, and if you look at which sectors in the country have the highest proportion of jobs purely in these three sectors, when you do it in percentage terms, Isles of Scilly comes out on the top. One caveat there is Isles of Scilly in absolute terms doesn't have the biggest labour market in the world, but nonetheless, almost 60% of its jobs are actually in accommodation and food, entertainment, retail, leisure, etc. And then some of the districts below that, which make up the top 10, the likes of South Lakeland, East Lindsey, Torbay, Cornwall, East Devon, Scarborough, they're all tourism destinations. They will have all been hit, although hopefully as we emerge from lockdown, they should hopefully have seen some sort of growth. As well as looking at it from a percentage point of view, though, percentage perspective, what you can also do is look at it in absolute terms. And when you look at the local authorities in the country that have, in absolute terms, the highest number of jobs in accommodation and food, entertainment, retail, leisure, etc., it changes. So you get some of the larger urban areas like Westminster, and particularly places like Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester, and you've got the likes of Liverpool, Sheffield, etc. When you look at places like Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester, one of the important points to make there is that Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester are local authorities, but they also contain city centres within them. And when you look at the composition of city centre labour markets, now this chart here is, it's total labour market jobs in Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester city centres combined, so they're not split out, they are very much combined. When you look at it, there were around about 470,000 jobs in those three city centres in 2018, which is the latest date you can get the information for. Almost 220,000 of those were in what you would traditionally describe as being office-based sort of jobs. And by that I mean sectors such as banking, finance, insurance, colleagues at Pegasus Group, what we do in planning, design, economics, etc., we would be classed as office-based workers. The other key thing though for city centres is obviously they have a large sort of accommodation and food services retail sectors. So if you look in this chart, you'll see you've got the orange segment represents retail jobs, just under 40,000. You've got the yellow box, which is arts, entertainment, etc., 19,000, and accommodation and food services is just over 40,000. So if my maths are correct, in those three city centres alone, there are about 100,000 retail, accommodation and food, recreation jobs that providing good sources of labour for people in the area. And when you add in the office-based employments, you're looking at just over 2/3 of all jobs are in those sectors. And my own view is I think that will be significantly higher because the circa 90,000 public sector jobs, a lot of them will be in office spaces as well in Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester. So retail has obviously been affected. I think there was, I saw a data analytics consultancy, I think it was in June, July time, they estimated that the retail sector in the UK will be £20 billion smaller in 2020 than they thought it would be at the start of 2019. So it's been a significant effect. The virus has had a significant effect rather. That's not to say there are opportunities having to emerge for certain sectors as a result of COVID-19. One of them is obviously online retail. So I've got a chart on the screen now. It just basically shows internet sales as a percentage of all retail sales in the UK from August 2010 through to August 2020. And 10 years ago, a decade, so quite a long time ago, the figure was about 7% of all internet sales 7% of all retail sales were done online. And during the pandemic, it peaked at about 33%. It's now come down to about 25-26%. So the long-term trend has been one of sort of an upward upward curve in terms of retail sales that are done online. It's gone down slightly in August 2020, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that it's going to continue remaining at relatively high levels compared to what it was in the past. When you consider internet sales and retail sales, etc., one of the impacts there is that obviously the warehousing sector is probably going to become increasingly important in terms of storing all the stuff that people want to buy online. And by that I mean things like warehouses for food, for household goods, etc. If people aren't going away as much, they may in theory spend more on their homes, home improvements, etc. Online supermarkets have obviously been doing very well during the pandemic. One of the things as well that we've looked at, moving on to a different topic in COVID-19, is the housing market. And a lot of people, when the pandemic started, thought that the housing market would seriously struggle. In reality, the complete opposite has happened. I think largely because the Chancellor, you probably all know this, has introduced, has removed stamp duty for properties up to £500,000 up to the end of March next year at the moment. I think the deadline is. So to put that into some sort of perspective, that means on average 9 out of 10 house buyers won't have to pay any stamp duty when they buy a house. So it's good for homeowners or home buyers. As of August 2020, this is taken from the Halifax House Price Index, so it's the latest data you can get. House prices are now at record highs, so approaching 245, 246,000. So it's one of the things people didn't necessarily expect at the start of the outbreak is the fact that the housing market has performed relatively well. Whether it does in the future is open to debate, particularly when the Chancellor's stamp duty initiative comes to an end. On the issue of houses, obviously people have been working from home more as a result of the restrictions, and I think that will continue. Historically, there has been a movement going back over the last decade to more people working from home, say 1 or 2 days a week, getting the work-life balance right. So I think you can probably expect that to continue. Building on that, the ONS I think it's every couple of weeks, does its opinions and lifestyle survey, and that's very useful for people like myself, because you can identify what the trends are in terms of people working from home. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that the red line basically represents people who are working from their traditional office or base of work all the time, i.e. they're not working from home. It was below 40% back in June when we were sort of slowly emerging from lockdown, I think. And as of sort of mid-September, the latest time frame the data are for, it's now up to about 50%. So it's been heading in an upward direction. And at the same time, the number of people, the light blue line, the number of people, or proportion of people working from home has actually been steadily declining. The one that's of particular interest to me is people who work from home and travel to work, i.e. goes back to the point I made a minute ago about getting the work-life balance right. So you'll have more people maybe splitting the time between home and office. I think we're just above 10% now. But what that will mean in terms of housing requirements, it might actually mean that people want bigger homes, or they're more willing to travel. If they're only going to be in the office in an urban area, say 2 days a week, they're more happy to travel further for those 2 days a week and live further away in an area where there may be things like more public space, open space to sort of have a better quality of life. And on top of the issue of working from home and building on the issue of sort of housing requirements in the future, the other thing we have to face, and this isn't just related to COVID-19, is the issue that we have a changing demographic profile of the national population, particularly around having an ageing population in virtually all parts of the country. And if you look at the latest population projections from the Office for National Statistics, they show that over a 20-year period from 2018 to 2038, a large proportion of population growth is almost entirely down to growth in the number of people aged 65 and over. So just over 4 million more, and just over 1 million more people who are 16 to 64. And the 16 to 64 age bracket is traditionally taken as people who are economically active in the labour market, although I appreciate more people are working into an older age now. The other interesting thing to notice that obviously the number of people, young people aged 0 to 15, is actually projected to go down by about 400,000. By having the change in demographic profile, that is going to significantly impact on what the country needs to provide in terms of future housing provision. Two things on that really. If there's more elderly people people are living longer, basically, you will need to ensure that the accommodation is better suited to their needs. So if at the moment you have people in areas who are living in homes that may be too big for them, but they can't move out because there's no accommodation that meets their needs, that throws open the question as to whether you need things like extra care schemes, assisted living schemes, that not only provide accommodation for more elderly people aged say 65, 70 and over, but if they leave their homes, it then frees up or unlocks their current homes for other economically active people to move into the area and support the local labour market. So you're probably asking yourself, why am I saying all this to you now? It's a load of data. What you do this all the time, you like it. What does this actually mean for the planning system? What does COVID-19 mean for the planning system? Well, I would say to highlight this using some nice looking infographics, what does it mean for planning? I think it's very, very important. It's always been important as per the MPPF, where you have to highlight three things for a planning application: the social, the economic and the environmental impacts of a scheme. And I think now more than ever, sat with my economics hat on at Pegasus Group, I think now more than ever, given what we're seeing with the labour markets, with unemployment, particularly for younger people, with changing demographic profiles, with increasing housing need, etc., highlighting the economic and social benefits of schemes is going to become even more important than it has been in the past. And you'll see on this slide now with the infographics, that doesn't just start when a scheme is developed and say people are living in it, if it's new homes, or people are working in it if it's commercial. It starts at the outset, and by that I mean the construction phase, because the construction phase, it brings investment to an area, it creates jobs, it brings added value, all of which can be quite easily calculated, so it can be put in things like vision documents, in planning applications, etc. A big thing moving forward, and the government is going to be focusing on, is the creation of jobs. So obviously, if you've got commercial schemes in any sector, particularly warehousing, I think, given everything happening with online retail, if you can show that you're creating significant job numbers for local authorities, for local enterprise partnerships, for combined authorities, etc., I think that's going to be a real plus. Housing schemes, for example, create revenue in the form of council tax, new homes bonus, etc. And skills is obviously going to be a very important issue, particularly in light of all the government's recent announcements in relation to young people. Skills isn't just about creating, it's not just about creating jobs from commercial schemes, it's about ensuring that people can upskill in the future. So it's about creating and developing apprenticeships. We've worked on over the last couple of years 1 or 2 employment skills and training strategies for clients to ensure that when the jobs are created, local people can access them, and that when they do get the jobs, they can actually continue learning in their place of work. Another one, which I think is becoming very important, is identifying or articulating the health benefits of schemes, be it economic or social. So if you have, say, an extra care scheme or assisted living scheme, what you can do is look at the extent to which that will improve people's quality of life. And by that I mean, say, reducing visits to GPs, to doctors, to accident and emergency departments in hospitals, and you can put an economic and social value on that. And then last but not least, in terms of the housing market, unlocking homes by providing accommodation that, say, meets the needs of more elderly people. So when they leave their homes to move into better accommodation that serves their needs, they actually free up housing stock in the area that people can live in. So I think that's it from me in terms of the economic and social benefits. I ended on the point about unlocking homes and supporting the housing market. On that note, I will now hand over to Matt to talk about housing supply and delivery.
Thank you, Richard. Interesting presentation. Hopefully we can follow that with some interesting insights into the housing market. So, as Richard said, I will be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on housing land supply. I'm sure most of us saw over the summer the various doomsday headlines throughout spring and summer anticipating the housing industry would grind to a halt and many sites would become unviable. Whilst the doomsday scenario hasn't thankfully occurred, it is clear that COVID-19 has had an impact upon housing delivery. And within this presentation, I'll take a brief look at the potential scale of that impact and consider how this may affect housing land supply. As with all black clouds, there is usually some form of silver lining, and this may be one of them. So in terms of official data, MHCLG haven't yet published their quarterly housing returns. In fact, that's not likely to happen for quite some time to come yet. So we need to look elsewhere for those data sources and give ourselves indicators of how the housing market has performed. One of those may be looking at energy performance certificates. There are other sources of data which we can use, but I think arguably energy performance certificates are some of the most appropriate. And these give an idea on the number of lodgements which have been made over a quarter. It's fair to say that EPCs are not a replacement for the official statistics, as they are required on all domestic properties or sales lets and such. New build only makes up a portion of EPCs, but they do provide an initial picture. So what's this data telling us? Firstly, it's telling us that in the orange line is Q1 and Q2 results. I've only used Q1 and Q2 on the basis that I wanted to make a clear comparison with previous years. So the grey line at the bottom is Q1 results and the blue line is Q2 results only. Given full lockdown didn't occur until the 23rd of March, it's unsurprising that the impact on housing delivery didn't really begin to bite until Q2 of this year. Prior to this, we'd seen a strong Q1 performance over the initial 3 months of 2020, so that's indicated by the grey line. We didn't really see any drop-off in Q1. However, following on from the end of March through April, May and June, we did see a quite significant drop away in terms of EPCs being submitted. And in fact, we're totaling around about 44% of the domestic EPCs for the same quarter in 2019. This is the lowest Q2 return of EPCs since at least 2009. In terms of the calendar year to date, we're running around 30% down on 2019. That's shown by the orange line. However, as I've already mentioned, that's largely offset by a strong Q1. So what the picture we see is Q1, i.e. January to the end of March, was quite strong. Following that, from March through June, we've seen quite significant drop-off in supply and delivery. So longevity of the impact, well, it's still a fair amount of uncertainty there. And whilst there have been some encouraging signs, with many house builders recording record order books since the easing of lockdown, there's still a question mark on whether this is pent-up demand or a sustained recovery. I've included at the side there a recent HBF poll, which identified that nearly 90% of participants working in the industry anticipate the effects will be felt for at least 1 year. Almost 44% of those anticipate it would last between 1 and 3 years. And this coincides with research by others. I've used Savills there as an example. There are others out there as well that have done similar property research, Knight Frank, etc. Savills was suggesting around about a 66% drop off this year, moving closer to 1920 levels of 80% in 21-22, and a full recovery to 1920 levels in 22-23. But based on the fact that we're trying to hit the government's 300,000 target, obviously a reduction on 1920 levels, which didn't get to that 300,000 target anyway, is of significant concern in terms of how things going forward. The government is clearly seeking to buoy the housing market through initiatives, some of which Richard mentioned, around stamp duty holidays until the end of March next year, extension of planning permissions and various other initiatives. However, I feel that many of these might be offset unless we hear better news this afternoon from a Chancellor regarding the cliff edge of furlough at the end of next month. This could have a significant effect on buyer demand, etc., going forward. So the effects on housing land supply. Well, there's an undoubted impact, but similar to the economic analysis which Richard gave, those impacts will vary between council areas. And there are a variety of reasons for that. It's something I think in terms of impact, councils themselves are all too well aware of. And you'll note the headline I've put there, which was the Sussex councils a couple of months ago, seeking to get ministers to suspend the 5-year requirement off the back of reduced delivery. Thankfully, to date, government hasn't actually conceded to that pressure. However, I do suspect as we go forward, there may be more calls for similar things from local authorities. In terms of issues to consider, I think there are some key things in terms of housing land supply, making arguments regarding 5-year supply. Firstly, length of site closures, how long without any work on site for individual developers. Delay to planning, decision making, evidence gathering or plan making. It's fair to say that most local authorities took at least a couple of months to get up to speed with their new digital processes for committees. Some took 3, and there were even 1 or 2 that took 4 or 5 months before they could really get up to speed with it. All that's had a negative impact upon getting permissions through the system. Similar with appeals, we've got quite a big backlog of appeals at the moment, and the appeals which are happening in early March took quite a long time to start to filter through in terms of decisions. I think buyer confidence going forward is going to be key as well, and that relates back to the furlough point. It also relates back to the point which Richard was making earlier in terms of individual local authorities, how reliant they are upon certain types of industries, particularly the service industries. That could have an impact in terms of buyers wanting to get onto the market, but also movers, and also being able to access mortgage finance, etc. In terms of housing land supply, one of the key elements which we need to consider is around the duration of sites and how long the build duration is going to be. Those sites which will be most affected are likely to be those with a longer build duration, i.e. those sites which will build out over the 5-year period and beyond. And the reason for that is, in terms of housing land supply arguments, is those with only a 2, 3, 4-year build period do have the opportunity to make up some of the lag from this year in later years in the 5-year housing land supply. So we may well see some fall off from all sites, but as time goes forward, they may well be able to catch that up. And finally, if I was a local authority, I would be most concerned if I was in that bracket of having a supply of around 6 years or less. Simply because they're going to be the most vulnerable to changes and to any volatility in terms of delivery over this year. The table which I put on now gives an idea of how we can look at COVID effects and the impact that might have on the market. These effects can either be drawn against the council's assumptions, or, as we have done in this case, post a traditional 5-year supply assessment. As can be seen from the modelling that we've undertaken, it suggests that the main impacts will be felt in 2020-21, with some residual impact in 21-22. We then see a return to normality in around about 22-23, prior to a degree of catch-up in 23-24 and beyond. So it mirrors many of the things in terms of the modelling we've done and the research we've done, mirrors many of the ideas that have been first put out by people like HBF and through that poll, but also through other consultancies and agencies such as Savills. In terms of decisions and how inspectors have dealt with housing land supply, and the Secretary of State as well, we're only slowly starting to see an emergence of these, and it's fair to say that at this point inspectors are still being fairly cautious. However, where there is compelling evidence, and that's presented clearly to an inspector, they are willing to discount the supply due to the effects of COVID-19. The first quote up there is from Christina Downs in relation to a case I was involved in Wokingham. And whilst the appeal was unfortunately ultimately unsuccessful, it is clear that the inspector in that case was more than willing to discount on the basis of the COVID-19 impacts. It's fair to say, if you look at that appeal decision as well, that assessment was done in the very early days of lockdown, so the period of lockdown at that stage was unknown, and we considered a fairly optimistic view of a 3 to 6 month period of impact. given what we now know, and given we now know the impact on the economy, we may want to push that a little bit further. And we could probably argue a more severe impact, but hindsight, as always, is a great thing. Things to be aware of though, you must provide evidence of the impact, and that must be on a case-by-case, site-by-site basis. And that was clear in the recent Secretary of State decision at Land at Hawthorns in Farnham. In that case, the Secretary of State was clear that because the appellant hadn't quantified the potential impact or put forward specific evidence about the deliverability of sites, it shouldn't affect his judgment in this case. I think one of the key things where decisions will start to become a lot clearer is once the official housing statistics begin to be released, and we should see a much clearer picture at that stage as to how much the impact of COVID has had on delivery, and that will ultimately give a far greater emphasis for inspectors to take that into account. So just to wrap up from me, clearly COVID-19 will have an impact on 5-year supply. I think the quantum of that is still up for debate. However, we can and are able to make arguments where fit to suggest and to identify how much of an impact they might have on a council's housing land supply. And local authorities, which should be most concerned, are those with 5 to 6 years supply. And on that basis, I will hand over to Neil to carry on, who's going to look at the standard method.
Hi all. Yeah, I've been asked to present a slight departure from the pandemic and discuss the proposed standard method, which is currently subject to consultation from the government. This presentation is rather timely in that regard because the current consultation ends a week today. Now, I would encourage everybody to respond as appropriate, but I'm simply going to provide some background to the need for the review of the standard method and some of the issues that have been raised by various parties in response to the proposed method of the government. The government has long acknowledged that there's been a need for 300,000 homes per annum nationally, and it's widely acknowledged that that's a significant challenge to deliver in England, as is evident from the chart at the bottom of this slide, which shows that we've been significantly below that figure for as long as I can remember, certainly. The government has, over the last 8 years, proposed and implemented numerous reforms to seek to boost the supply of housing to respond appropriately. Perhaps one of the most pivotal of those was the introduction of the current standard method in July 2018. Now, that current standard method rather strangely, never provided for 300,000 homes per annum. Indeed, it now only provides for 265,000 homes per annum. So the government's key proposal to provide for 300,000 didn't in itself provide for 300,000, which is a seeming absurdity. It's also become subject to increasing levels of challenge, particularly because it relies upon the 2014 based household projections, which are now very long in the tooth and don't really reflect reality as it now is. The results of the current standard method also throw up some strange distributions, and just one of those that I'll draw attention to. If you look at the chart in the North East, North West, Yorkshire and Humber and West Midlands, the number of homes delivered in those regions is greater than the need identified by the current standard method. Now, unless developers have been building houses which aren't needed, and they're therefore presumably vacant, it would appear that the current standard method isn't providing a meaningful measure of needs in at least some regions and local authorities. The converse may be true in London and the South East, where the opposite occurs, although that could be influenced by constraints. But there are certainly a number of issues with the current standard method which which are causing concern to various parties. Now, the government has long recognised that the current standard method was and is in need of review. Indeed, even prior to its implementation, the government identified that it needed to be continually reviewed to ensure that it continued to provide for 300,000 per annum, notwithstanding the fact that it didn't even provide for 300,000 per annum at its implementation. The government has similarly repeatedly identified the need for a review in order that we take an appropriate response to the housing need for 300,000 per annum. And there's some examples of where those need for the review quotes come from. So we all woke up in August to huge jubilation as the government announced a new standard method for consultation. Even better, it provides for 337,000 homes per annum nationally. So there was much applause at the time. The headline figures were brilliant. We've got a new standard method. It hopefully addresses some of the problems with the current standard method, and it provides, if anything, more than sufficient homes to meet the national housing need. However, once you get below the skin of it and begin doing the detailed analysis, the response has been more lukewarm, shall we say. I'm sure many of you are aware that there's been an expert group formed between consultancies, including Pegasus Group, and a number of QCs who have gone through some of the outputs of the proposed standard method and identified a number of concerns. Similarly, there's been a widespread political response, particularly from Conservative backbenchers, and I provide a few quotes there, but words such as Stalinist have been used in response. Now, whilst there are issues with the current standard method, we should take a step back and realise that actually it's a review. It provides for enough homes nationally and, well, at least at first glance, and it provides a very good starting point, providing we can address some of the concerns that have been raised by these parties through the consultation and assuming the government responds accordingly. It is progress, so we shouldn't lose sight of the positivity. However, there are these concerns, and I'll quickly run through a few of those, which if you agree, I would suggest that you respond to within a consultation response that you put forward. The first of which that I've identified is London. So the government's new proposed figures produce a need for 94,000 homes per annum in London. The current the emerging London plan, which we can only assume will be adopted soonish, sets a requirement for only 52,000 homes. So assuming that that is adopted unchanged, that will provide the housing requirement for London for the next 5 years until it becomes 5 years old, and therefore the standard method begins to apply. So that means that as a result, we're already 42,000 short in London. That means that the 337,000 headline figure identified by the government is at most 295,000. Immediately, we're not planning for or even recognising the 300,000 homes required according to the government. Similarly, the proposed method of the government reflects the change in affordability over the previous 10 years. Now, currently, in forming that 337,000, it's the change over the period 2009 to 19, because that's the latest decade for which figures are available. Now, as you'll see from the chart, in 2009, housing was markedly more affordable than it was in either 2008 or 2010. Now, that has the effect of exaggerating the change of affordability in the current figures. Now, just by way of a proxy, it's impossible to know what the affordability will be in 2020 as yet, but by way of a proxy, if we were to assume that the housing remained as affordable in 2020 as it was in 2019, so therefore we'd go from the solid black line on that chart to the dotted black line, that would reduce the results of the government standard method by 33,000 homes. So even without taking account of London, that would reduce from 337 down to 304, or if you take it out of London, it would reduce from 295 to 262. Now that's just an illustration. We don't know what the affordability will be in 2020, but it gives a sense that there's significant volatility in the proposed standard method, and that I think it's very possible that it will produce a much lower figure come the publication of new affordability information in February, March next year. Indeed, a figure significantly below 300,000. That's also compounded by the fact, as we all know, that many local authorities are constrained such that they cannot meet the minimum need identified by the standard method. And therefore, even if we, based on the two preceding slides, and I appreciate there's some uncertainty on those, once constraints are taken account, and assuming that they're not always picked up through the duty to cooperate, as they sometimes aren't, we will be planning for and recognising far less than even 260,000 homes per annum. So the headline figure of 337,000 put forward by the government, which is welcomed, is a bit of a misnomer, and it doesn't provide a sufficient buffer to actually deliver the 300,000, which is the objective. Similarly, well, an entirely separate point, the government announced one of the objectives of the standard method was to encourage greater building in urban areas. However, the proposed standard method actually results in significantly lower numbers in a large number of the larger urban areas across the country, and some examples are just provided in that slide. So it appears that there's a bit of an anomaly there, in that the proposed standard method doesn't actually support the objective it's intended to, another one of the objectives it's intended to. And the final concern, well, there are many more, but the final principal concern that I'll flag is the regional distribution. So the government have identified in the current consultation that the new standard method is seeking to achieve a better distribution of homes, including supporting the Northern Powerhouse. However, as set out in the statistics at the bottom of this screen, the results of the proposed standard method are even more southeast centric than the current standard method. It doesn't support the Northern Powerhouse, or indeed the needs equitably across the country, arguably. But having said all that, we welcome the review, and large parts of the proposed standard method are to be supportive. There are these concerns which we hope will be addressed through the consultation and the government's response to that consultation. And that's the important thing to bear in mind. It does remain open to consultation, and we will just have to wait and see what the final outputs are. At the moment, I'm saying that the results can be afforded very limited weight because of the level of concern. But in some instances, it does provide an indicative direction of travel, but again, which can be afforded at most very limited weight. And in some instances where it throws up those anomalous figures, I would say next to no weight. The other thing to have mind to is the fact that this is only an interim proposal. Under the white paper, the government have identified a proposal to introduce yet another standard method which takes account of constraints to provide a binding housing requirement. That's not to say don't respond to this consultation which identifies the interim standard method. Please do, and I encourage you to, but rather that this is only a short-term measure, and there will, the position will continue to evolve. I hope that very brief overview is useful and encourages one or two of you to respond to the current consultation. If I can hand over to questions and answers. And Richard, are you there?
Thanks, Neil. Yeah. Right, Matt, you're back as well. Good. The technology is still working. Right, thanks for that. Hopefully everybody who's signed on for the webinar has found it useful. I guess, Neil, I've seen there's one question popped up on the screen, but before we come to that, Neil, I've just got a question for you, building on your slides about the standard method. You said obviously the consultation ends, it's a week today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that gives a genuine opportunity? Do you think the government's basically going to shift its stance on the standard method, given all the issues that have arisen with it and you've just articulated? Do you think there's a chance to genuinely shape any changes in the standard method during the consultation?
For everything I've heard from the government has been very positive, and I applaud them for that. I heard Simon Gallagher on Have I Got Planning News for You last week or the week before, saying exactly that this is far from set in stone, and that they are beginning to recognise, especially given the political backlash, I think, that there are issues, and if we can come up with pragmatic solutions, they will pay due regard to those and modify the proposal accordingly. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons that I'm encouraging people to respond, because there is a real opportunity here to get a meaningful figure endorsed in national guidance and policy.
Just on that, Neil, you've got another question come in. What sort of changes could the government make to reduce the volatility of the standard method?
Well, volatility in the current standard method, in the current and proposed standard method, arises from a number of factors. The first of those is the use of household projections, which broadly reflect what a LPA has delivered in the preceding few years. So if you deliver a lot of housing, suddenly your standard method comes out a lot higher. If you don't deliver housing, it comes out a lot lower, exactly the opposite of what you actually want. Because if you don't deliver housing, your need should increase, and that, vice versa. So I would, and I think this is largely supported by consultancies, recommend that the household projections are entirely removed from the standard method. The government has gone halfway on that and said it's the higher of either the household projections or the existing dwelling stock. But I would suggest the household projections, the removal of those will remove the volatility. In terms of the volatility that I discussed in my presentation, in terms of the change in affordability over the previous decade, I think that there are very good reasons why change in affordability is a pragmatic thing to put in the standard method. There could be refinements which might reflect that, which might result in less volatility. Such as doing the medium rate of change over the previous decade, so that actually the extremes, such as that significant improvement in affordability in 2009, is dismissed because you're using a median rather than an average. But I can't see the government necessarily going that far. But there are solutions, and anything that anybody can propose, because I'm thinking off the top of my head on that one, would be welcomed by the government, I'm sure.
It sounds as though they're going to get a lot of, hopefully a lot of feedback as part of this consultation. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a big exercise for the government, because even working amongst the expert group of consultancies, and Matthew's been involved in this, every consultancy has got their own ideas. Whilst there are broad lines of consensus, different consultancies have different ideas, and trying to understand each of those and compare and contrast them will be a big exercise for the government. But I hope that they do so in order to address some of the concerns with the proposal.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Right, we've got another couple of questions coming. There's one that I think is for me, and then Matt, I think the other one is for you. First one for me says, has anything been published yet as to how the second lockdown might impact the V-shaped recovery in GDP? Not as far as I'm aware. I've not seen anything from the government in the OBR in terms of future forecasts. What I have seen is some estimates were produced this morning that said if we went into a second lockdown, the hospitality industry could lose over 500,000 jobs nationally, and obviously that would impact on GDP. You'd like to think that if we don't have a full second lockdown, even with the local lockdowns, with the introduction of things like the track and test app today from the NHS, you would like to think that people do still have money that's been saved up over the last few months during the last lockdown, and they will spend it and the economy will keep growing. Whether that means we see a full-on V-shaped recovery, I would have doubts. If we go into a second full lockdown, I don't think there will be a V-shaped recovery. I think people have talked about an L-shaped recovery. I think they're going through every letter of the alphabet. So I think watch this space. If there is a second lockdown, I don't think there will be a V-shaped recovery. But if there isn't a second lockdown, then hopefully the economy does continue growing, but it might be a bit of a bumpy ride over the next 1 to 2 years. I think this question is for you, Matt. Says,
I can answer it, Richard. In terms of where does the unmet need go if a constrained authority area, if the duty to cooperate is removed, I think it relates to the standard method, but essentially at a point in time that's a difficult one to answer, to be honest, and is something which I would wholly recommend people get engaged in terms of the white paper response. As is correctly noted on there, the white paper does propose to remove the duty to cooperate because government considers it not to work. And I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think it's been a difficult issue for local authorities and inspectors to deal with in terms of how to deal with unmet need from somewhere else. We only need to look at Birmingham as a prime example of that and how that is still unresolved after many, many years. At this point in time, it would appear that doesn't really go anywhere, but that is something which I think the government needs to address through its more detailed considerations as part of the white paper standard method, i.e. if there is constraints in an area, how we deal with those. If there aren't constraints within an area, does that mean that we should have a higher housing requirement? I think that's part of potentially where the government could go with this, but I encourage people to make comments on that because it is very unclear at the moment in terms of how government intend that to be dealt with. And if we don't deal with it, we'll see a lot of housing fall between the cracks. Yeah,
if I can just pick up on an aspect of that. So as Matt rightly says, it's in the white paper rather than the current consultation on changes to the current planning system. The proposal is that duty to cooperate is removed when there's a binding housing requirement. So that binding housing requirement should address the needs nationally. But the issue that Matt's picked up on, and I think the question probably reflects on, is if, let's say, London is constrained and therefore it has a lower binding housing requirement. If you use a standard method, that unmet need will be distributed evenly across the country. So you're not actually meeting the needs where they arise. And that's the major headache that the government have got coming forward in how they do that constrained binding housing standard method in the future. And there are no answers as yet.
Okay, we have one other question, Neil. I think this might be a bit of me, but more you, to put the pressure on you. Says, house prices are currently rising due to the stamp duty holiday. Is this therefore likely to have an adverse effect on affordability? And if so, what would the implications be for the new standard method?
I saw Richard's slide as well and saw that house prices are seemingly increasing. So in terms of the change in house prices, the affordability ratio arises from two factors: the house prices and income earnings. Now, the 2020 affordability ratio will be based on the average house prices from September 2019 to September 2020. So that will broadly reflect what Richard showed in his chart. However, it will reflect the earnings data from April 2019 to March 2020. So, i.e. prior to lockdown. So you'd expect the earnings to, in the absence of any other information, to have broadly followed the same trend. Admittedly, following lockdown, it will have a negative impact. And therefore, you'd expect house prices to rise at broadly the same rate as earnings, and therefore affordability to be broadly consistent in 2020 as it will be in 2019. However, then the year afterwards, by the time we get to 2021, because of the impact of the pandemic on earnings, we would expect affordability to be much worse. And therefore, precisely the opposite of what I showed in my chart, the result of the standard method nationally could significantly increase. But this all just goes to the point of the volatility that arises from the change in trends over 10 years. And that's an issue that I at least hope the government understand, that it's more the volatility rather than, well, I mean, the direction of travel will be material, because if we get below the 300,000, as I expect we will come April, that's an issue in itself. But if it goes up, then the harm, I'm not quite sure what the harm is, apart from if you're preparing a local plan, because you just afford more weight to housing effectively in the decision-making arena.
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite interesting what happens over the next 1 to 2 years with the economy and on things like affordability. And I think a lot of it, in the government's defence, it's hard to predict. We don't know what will happen in a lot of areas at the moment. And I guess the issue of affordability will sort of be quite prominent when the responses come in for the standard method consultation, because housing is a very emotive subject, isn't it? Okay, I think we've covered all the questions that have come through on Zoom. Neil or Matt, have you got any other points that you want to add or any other issues you want to raise?
Just a quick one for you, actually, Richard. Interesting set of slides, and I was just wondering, in light of what's happening with the pandemic, have you seen an increased focus on the impact of schemes in terms of economic and social benefits?
I think we've started to, yes. I think one or two councils have sort of started coming as part of schemes we've been involved with, saying they want to identify what the, you know, things like job creation and economic benefits are of schemes. Funnily enough, despite tourism not doing very well on an international scale, UK domestic tourism has been doing quite well with the rise of the staycations, and we've been involved with a few holiday schemes over the last few months, making the case for those in terms of attracting visitors. And I think one final point for me would be, obviously we always focus very heavily on the economic benefits, so jobs, GVA, wages, etc. I think one of the things of the pandemic will be to sort of flip that to a degree. Don't get me wrong, the economic impacts will continue to be important, but the social impact and the social benefits of schemes in terms of getting unemployed people back to work and improving people's mental health and well-being, I've seen far more focus on what are the social benefits of schemes. Now, we've been working with a client in the East Midlands since June, actually, trying to get access to them for funding from one of the local enterprise partnerships. And on the business case for when we did it, there was a big section on the social impact. And historically, in my experience, it's always been sort of a throwaway question on social impact. But this time it was, no, you had to go into far more detail on what the social benefits were of your particular scheme. And I guess I'll be biased because it's what I'm interested in, but I think we will see more of that in the future because of the pandemic. I think it was kind of heading that way on the social side, but I think it will speed it up, as a lot of the stuff we've talked about in terms of, you know, more people working from home to get a better work-life balance, the changing face of city centres. It was happening anyway, and COVID will probably speed it all up. So does that help?
It does, yeah. No, it's interesting because obviously the information coming out of councils at the moment, they seem to be quite keen on the social benefits, and the reasons for that are quite clear, I think, and it's just whether that was being reflected through the evidence we've been asked to present.
Well, later on this afternoon, I've got a call with a potential client to talk about the economic and social benefits of some money that they're investing in their town centre, so it's a hot topic. So very timely question, Matt. Right, if there is nothing else from Matt and Neil, I'll thank everybody for attending the webinar. Hopefully you found it useful. For everybody who attended and registered, copies of the slides will be coming around by the end of the week, and our contact details are on them. So obviously if you want to pick up anything offline, we'll be more than happy to do so. So thanks everybody.